I'm Mina Malik Hussain, and you're watching The Coffee Table. And as always, today we have a fascinating show ready for you. We're going to be talking about the criminal justice system in Pakistan, which actually is really fascinating. And there are so many important things that are happening under the aegis of it. And we have two fantastic lawyers on the show today to be telling us more about the criminal justice system in Pakistan, the reality of it, on the ground, what's happening, and reforms that are necessary to make everybody's lives much better. Joining me on set today is Omar Maniyar, who is a rule of law and legal empowerment practitioner. He is the Deputy Provincial Team Lead at the Justice System Support Program, which is a technical assistance program that works to improve the performance of criminal justice institutions in Punjab and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. Excellent, well done. And joining me through the internet is Jugnoo Kazmi, who is a legal and policy specialist and works at the Justice Project Pakistan. She also leads the Women in Law Initiative's Islamabad chapter and has been appointed Defense Counsel in Jail Appeals by the Islamabad High Court. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having us.
This is very exciting. Now, I realize that, criminal justice sounds really serious, and it actually is very serious. But I like to begin at the beginning, as it were. So, what happens once you commit a crime and you thereby enter this particular kind of justice system?
So if I could flip the question.
Yes.
So instead of...
Don't ask me.
Instead of focusing on the person committing the crime,
yes.
if we were to follow the trajectory of the victim of a crime,
yes.
that might be more useful. From the perspective of how do state institutions then ensure that the victim who suffered a loss
yes.
is delivered justice.
Right.
And that really is the trajectory of the criminal justice system. And there's a couple of interesting elements there about how the victim interacts with the criminal justice system as well as how the state uses the criminal justice system.
Right.
But fundamentally, if you're the victim of a crime, your first step would either to be to call the police helpline, which is 15,
yes.
or alternatively, you could walk into a police station.
Okay.
And from there on, the criminal justice system comes into action, and you see the entire chain from first response, where the 15 officers will respond to your distress call, or alternatively, the registration of an FIR after a complaint is registered, and then that follows investigation and then prosecution, and then we have a long time period up until justice is finally delivered at the end.
Okay, so your point of the first point of call is the police and that FIR, and then thereby the sort of the system. You are part of the system. Then I'm phrasing it really awkwardly because I don't know the correct legal terminology. So Jugnoo, hi, can you hear me?
I can hear you very well.
Hello, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Mina. Thank you for having me on the show.
I'm delighted. So, and I just hope that the internet, stays with us. So, Jugnoo, can you tell me a little bit about what the Justice Project Pakistan does?
So, Justice Project Pakistan, very simply put, fights for the rights of prisoners who are either mentally ill or those who are juveniles, or those who are Pakistani prisoners imprisoned abroad, or those who are victims and survivors of police torture. So, nobody really thinks of prisoners because the mindset really is that, once you're imprisoned or that you've committed a crime, therefore you must be a bad person. But that's not true. That's not all. So JPP's work is very niche, and we only work with prisoners. So a lot of work to do with prisons and courts, and of course other governmental bodies.
So Jugnoo, I know that a lot of JPP's work is about people knowing their legal rights and about victims and perpetrators of crimes having a fair trial and adequate representation. So what does it mean to have, for example, adequate representation?
Adequate representation, in my mind, would be that you have a right to counsel, and then right to a fair trial, which is a protected right under the Constitution. Right. This is Article 10A. Now a lot of our prisoners, so JPP, and this is something that I forgot to mention earlier, JPP works for prisoners who are on death row, but prisoners who are imprisoned abroad and juveniles and mentally ill. And So adequate representation is when you have right to counsel, and so this is also protected right under the Constitution of Pakistan. This is Article 10A. So people who we represent at JPP, they're most often than not poor people, and these prisoners are on death row who can't afford private counsel. So then we jump in and we represent them, and file cases and plead their cases before different courts of law. So adequate representation really would be having access to their complete records, which includes medical records, because you see most of our clients, these are either juveniles or those who are mentally ill. So it's pertinent for us to be able to get a hold of their medical records and, of course, other history of, like past behavior and family history and, all of that.
Yeah, and that's something that I want to sort of... that I want to come back to in a minute. But Omar, do we have a public defender's office?
Yes and no. So in Sindh, for example, prior to my current project, I was working with the Legal Aid Office and the Legal Aid Society, which is funded by the government of Sindh, and it's one of the largest legal aid programs in South Asia at the moment. And the office would represent close to 2,500 to 3,000 people every year. And these are people that couldn't afford a lawyer. In Punjab, on the other hand, we do have organizations like Asma Jahangir's organization or Hina Jilani Sahiba's organization, which is Dastak, that are doing some fantastic work in this area. But from a state perspective, we've had a law since 2018, which is the Punjab Legal Aid Agency Act, which calls for the provision of free legal aid, but it hasn't been operationalized yet. So that's something that the project that I'm currently on is also working to support the government on. But as of right now, we don't have a public defender system as such.
But why is that problematic?
So that's particularly problematic if you look at the socioeconomic profile of who goes to jail. And you will see primarily that compared to the rest of the population, we're looking at lower literacy levels on average, we're looking at a lower economic earning potential, etc. So these are primarily people that either don't understand the formal criminal justice system or don't have the resources to be able to navigate it. And of course, right to counsel is part of the fundamental right that you have in the Constitution under the right to fair trial. So if you can't afford a lawyer, that fundamental right is at risk. So it is the state's responsibility to make sure that everybody that is facing trial has access to legal counsel.
So what happens if you don't have access to legal counsel?
So at the moment, you have the opportunity to represent yourself.
Right. Which means plead your own case.
You can plead your own case, absolutely.
But then how can you do that if you are at a low literacy level and you...
No, so absolutely. Even at a high literacy level, our criminal justice system is often so complicated. We have so many of these procedural rules that it would be difficult for anyone to navigate.
Quite right.
And having said that, so if you don't have a lawyer, it's close to impossible. With the exception of very serious crimes which carry the death penalty, and the death penalty is a reality in Pakistan, where the trial will not proceed until you have a lawyer. And what that means is either you will spend a long time waiting to arrange a lawyer. So a waiting trial, not necessarily on death row, so a waiting trial. And you'll wait a long time for either for you to be able to afford a lawyer or that the judge will appoint a lawyer on your behalf. And that again goes back to if it's adequate legal counsel, because what we have also seen is that court-appointed lawyers may not necessarily take the same level of interest or put in the same level of effort as privately appointed counsel will.
And then doesn't it kind of become a vicious circle where if there is no public defender's office, so then when the court appoints a lawyer, are they expected to work pro bono? Like who pays that lawyer?
So officially the government is liable to pay that lawyer.
Right.
What we know in practice is that hasn't really happened. So lawyers will find other creative means of paying for their services.
Yeah, well, yeah, I'm chuckling, but it's true, actually. So when you are awaiting trial, and I believe that this is actually one of the main reasons why, because we can't talk about criminal justice without talking about prisons, because if you are awaiting trial or you are an accused person, then you will be you will be detained by the state, and that is in a prison.
Yes. So Our criminal justice system distinguishes between two types of crimes. There are the types of crimes for which you can get bail. So you can, post a certain amount as bail, and you'll be released while your trial is ongoing. The other types of crimes that we have are non-bailable offences, where even if you were to be able to put up bail, they would not be able to release you. And these are the most serious crimes, such as murder or serious sexual violence type crimes. And when you look at the prison population, what you see across Pakistan is the vast majority of people in prison at the moment are under trial prisoners. So in Punjab also, it's in excess of 60% of the prison population is under trial at the moment. And of course, prisons are terribly overcrowded and don't have the best facilities either. So one, we see that that's the trend, is that if you're in for a non-bailable offense, you're going to spend on average 6 months to up to 2 years in prison while your trial is ongoing.
That's a long time.
It absolutely is. Now,
and then if your trial then gets extended or drawn out, as I'm sure it is often, then you're there for even longer.
So thankfully, I think, and I shouldn't say thankfully, oddly enough, our criminal justice system also recognizes the fact that it's a broken system with delays. So as per the law, even if you are in for a crime as serious as murder, you then become eligible for bail if you've been in prison for up to 2 years. So if your trial has not been concluded, and you could be found guilty later, but then you have a right to bail just by virtue of the fact that you've spent 2 years under trial in prison. So it's called statutory bail. And for murder, it's about 2 years. For serious sexual violence, etc., it can be slightly lower, about a year. And then for juvenile prisoners, it's up to 3 months to 6 months. Then they become eligible for bail, even in non-bailable cases.
We're going to take a very quick break and come back to this very serious and oddly fascinating conversation. Stay with us. Hi, welcome back to the coffee table. We're talking about the criminal justice system in Pakistan and prisons with Omar Maniyar and Jugnoo Kazmi. So Jugnoo, we're talking about prisons and prisoners. So tell me more about juvenile prisoners. Now, from the term, naturally, it implies a younger person. But is it sort of people who are 18 and under who break the law? Those are juveniles.
So juvenile prisoners, simply put, are prisoners who are under the age of 18. The governing act is the Juvenile Justice System Act of 2018, which prohibits a death penalty being awarded to a juvenile. And it basically also gives greater protection of child rights in the justice system. And, it safeguards arrest to juveniles under Section 5(1), and that they need to be kept in an observation room, and the police officer would inform the guardian of the juvenile as soon as possible after the arrest of the juvenile. And then they have the right of legal assistance, observation homes, and juvenile rehab centers. However, the reality is,
Yes, carry on.
However, the reality is a bit different because even though we have this law in place, the question really is about implementation, which is always a problem. And this is just not with juveniles, but overall, if we talk about the criminal justice system.
So you said
to determine juvenile.
So you mentioned juvenile rehabilitation centers. So from what I understand, juvenile offenders are not sent to jail. They are there's a separate system for them.
They're supposed to be, absolutely. But then, implementation of it is always a question. Because to determine juvenility, courts are supposed to carry out this ossification test, which, if they don't have any, for instance, birth record or school record that states their age, then the courts are supposed to carry out a ossification test to determine their age. But we've seen with our clients, that it's always, a problem, and we've, filed cases in courts trying to determine the juvenility of prisoners, because if they're juveniles on paper, but then the court doesn't believe them, so that's always an issue.
So are there crimes that are more commonly committed by juveniles as opposed to adults, or is it just across the board more or less the same?
No, I wouldn't think so. But then juveniles are, they're arrested for all kinds of crimes, be it murder or crimes involving drugs, which we call narcotics. And, then there's always this question of whether, they did it or whether they were framed into it or whether, they had the right understanding or the maturity or whatever you want to call it to actually commit these crimes. Because if someone's below 18, of course, their understanding of many things is very different. We can also take our example. I was an idiot when I was, a teenager.
It's true, as I think all of us were, and you are easily led and you are easily influenced. But this is also, and this is something that we were talking about, Omar, is that how does the state punish you is very much a part of this conversation and about criminal justice and justice generally, is that for juveniles, surely there should be alternatives to punish, different kinds of punishment or alternatives. But then if a 17-year-old has killed someone, that's incredibly serious.
Absolutely. So I think to Jugnoo's point, firstly, often what we've seen in my experience in Sindh is that juveniles are either involved in economic crimes, some petty theft type crimes. And we also see a large amount of juveniles being involved in narcotics cases. And that is because for narcotics, if you're an adult, you're punishable with the death penalty. Whereas if you're a juvenile on paper, you can't be punished with the death penalty. So you'll see juveniles being used by other adults to commit these crimes, such as drug trafficking or drug distribution. But to your question, I think we really as a society do need to reevaluate why we punish people and why we send them to prison. If you look at our prison legislation, it dates back to 1898. That's how old the legislation is, and it's been amended over time. But as I think the most recent amendments came in the 1960s. So we still focus on sending people to prison in order to punish them, as compared to the various other theories that we now have, which includes rehabilitation. So, if somebody goes in as a convicted criminal, they should come out better able to navigate society without necessarily having to commit a crime. So you want to give them education, you want to give them skills, you want to work on values, etc. over time and enable them to make a better life for themselves. For juveniles in particular, there is on the books there is talk about juvenile rehabilitation centers. But again, what I can tell you is that what were originally juvenile prisons, they've changed the name on the prison and called it a Borstal institution or a youthful offenders industrial school. But it's still
that sounds very Victorian.
It's
Dickensian almost.
Industrial school, which is still within the four walls of a central prison or a district prison. So it's separate barracks altogether. So juveniles aren't kept with adults. But effectively, it's the same staff. It's the same regime that administers them, and it's still administered by the prison system, and that is definitely a problem.
I'm just taking a moment to think about. And poor little juvenile prisoners is really frightening. And as a young person, if you committed this crime, and you should have a fighting chance for a reformed life after that. So we don't have a kind of overarching ministry, let's say, that looks after all of these things. Like, who's in charge of prison superintendents, for example, to make sure that prisons are being run in accordance with human rights conventions and the laws that exist?
So officially, the prison department itself is an independent executive body. So it's headed by an inspector general, and then they have a whole system under them to look at it. In addition to that, you also have a minister for prisons in every province. Now, this is a provincially administered subject, but at the same time, of course, the Ministry of Human Rights will from time to time issue relevant guidance and things like that. But if you look at how prisons are actually administered, they're administered using what's called the Pakistan Prison Rules, which were codified in the 1970s. And it's about 1,250 rules. That regulate everything from the weight of the tea that has to be given to a certain class of prisoner in the morning, up to everything such as drug rehabilitation.
So technically, there's a very sort of detailed manual on how to run a prison.
There is a very detailed and very outdated manual.
Yes.
And in Punjab, at least, I know JPP and the Justice System Support Program have worked with the government of Punjab in order to revise all 1,250 rules and bring them up to at least modern day standards and our commitments under international conventions.
So, Omar, I know that Pakistan has ratified the UN Convention Against Torture and Cruel and Inhuman Practices.
Yeah.
And we've also ratified the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which means that internationally, many countries agree that there's a certain level of humanity that we should be operating on or within that ambit. But do you feel like that trickles down adequately to what's actually happening on the ground?
So unfortunately, the incentives aren't there to enforce compliance. So one, whenever you sign an international convention, it doesn't really hold weight until you have domestic legislation on it.
Yes.
So you spoke about the Convention Against Torture, which we've signed for a while now, but we still haven't seen domestic legislation in Pakistan to give that sort of to enforce the commitments that we've made. On the other minimum standards, when we talk about ICESR, etc., those we have not only signed and ratified, but have made a public commitment to, and then Pakistan does periodically submit to a review to that effect. I think the most relevant standards that we've signed on to is the UN minimum standards for the treatment of prisoners. They're also called the Nelson Mandela rules. So there are those. There are then the Bangkok rules that specifically talk about how women prisoners ought to be treated. But again, we've sort of signed on to these international agreements, if you will, or sort of understandings for minimum standards. But those haven't really been sort of implemented in our own local laws yet. And that's the big effort that's being made right now, is to revise the prison legislation, revise the prison rules, and bring them into compliance with those international conventions so that we can start implementing them.
Yeah. So I imagine that this would be a kind of dual effect, because it would help make prisons and the justice system more efficient, and it would also make us look very good in front of everybody else.
So that's kind of how the international law regime works, right? Primarily what it is it's about your reputation.
Yes.
So when we think of criminal justice reform, or you think of things like the death penalty, or you think of things like torture, a lot of it is tied to discussions around trade concessions with the European Union, for example, or other concessions that we might have with other countries. So without that incentive, really, it's very difficult to ensure compliance at the local level. Having said that, I think the criminal justice system needs much more fundamental reform. And so the prisons is the one component is kind of the end product, and really gives you a clear insight into how we view alleged criminals or anyone who's been accused of a crime.
Absolutely.
And how we treat them. But of course, in this entire conversation, we also have to remember that you have to keep the victims' rights and society's interests in mind when it comes to ensuring that justice is done.
Absolutely. And it is important to remember that the justice system and the prison system is the sort of public's first port of call, in that way that how we perceive justice or access to justice has a lot to do with how that justice is meted out. And I believe that our conviction rates are incredibly low for a variety of reasons.
Absolutely. So there's, I mean, we'll run out of time on your show if we go through all the reasons. But so it really does underscore what we mean by public trust, right? So what we've seen is that the criminal justice system doesn't enjoy the public trust, and criminal justice institutions aren't trusted by the public.
Yes, that's right.
So often, if you have a choice between reporting something to the police and not reporting it, more people will choose not to report a crime.
And for a variety of crimes, for like
a variety of
almost everything.
With the exception of murder, which is considered a 100% reporting crime because you have, unfortunately, a dead body. And that can only be processed through the formal criminal justice system. Particularly around sexual violence, we see underreporting. And then from then on begins sort of the cycle of all of those little elements that undermine the public trust. So despite, the Punjab police, I can tell you, has made significant investments in trying to improve the experience of complainants, but it does fundamentally break down every single time somebody has a bad experience with the criminal justice system. So often complainants will be apprehensive of corruption, they'll be apprehensive of how long it's going to take, how expensive it'll be officially to go through the system. But more than that, you have to really question what is it that they expect at the end of it, right? So for a victim of crime, to have their accused go away to prison might satisfy some of their requirements. But the criminal justice system really doesn't focus on the victim. It is the state that prosecutes, and the victim is there, or the complainant is there to provide evidence. And that's how we view the complainant in this entire scheme of things. So over time, what we really want to do is work towards what's called restorative justice.
Okay.
And the idea is that at least part of your criminal justice system is oriented towards restoring the sense of loss that the victim has suffered.
Yeah, I think that that's actually really important. And do you think that that's where the death penalty also kind of factors into this idea of restoration, where a complainant would feel like justice has been done if somebody receives a capital punishment?
So often that's the argument that's made, right? An eye for an eye. So if somebody commits murder, then the punishment against them that you're entitled to as a complainant, you could make the argument would be the death penalty. But with the death penalty in particular, what we've seen, including in Pakistan as well as around the world, is two, I think, important things. One, the criminal justice system is not infallible. It makes mistakes. And we see that on the other side more so than we see in convictions. So what we know is that in homicide or murder cases, the conviction rate is at around about 10%. So 90% of the people arrested will be released and declared innocent by a court of law.
What?
And then of the ones that have been convicted and have been sentenced either to the death penalty or life imprisonment, 97% of those convictions are either overturned or the sentence is reduced by superior courts, such as the High Court and the Supreme Court. So the chance that you're going to be punished, again, going back to what victims will expect, the chance that you're going to be punished in Pakistan is very, very low.
And that sounds really frustrating.
It absolutely
Even just
is.
to hear it, I'm just like, excuse me.
Yeah. So in terms of prioritizing, how we go about fixing this problem, it honestly is a mess. You could spend your entire life identifying issues in the criminal justice system, whether it's police investigation or first response or victim treatment, or how prosecutors are empowered in court, how the court system functions, things like witness protection, use of forensic evidence. All of these areas need work.
And we are working on it, but it's also like there's so much of it, and there's a lot of work to be done still. We're going to take a very quick break and come back to this really interesting conversation. Stay with us. Hi, welcome back to the coffee table. We've been having an absolutely riveting conversation about the criminal justice system and situation in Pakistan with Omar Maniyar from the Justice System Support Program Project and Jugnoo Kazmi from the Justice Project Pakistan. So Jugnoo, tell me about women in prison. So is it the same kind of thing where, like Omar mentioned, juveniles have a separate kind of section in the larger prison? Is that the same for women also, or do we have separate prisons for women?
That is true. That is true. So women have separate barracks.
Okay.
There's only one all-female jail. But other than that, Central Jail Rawalpindi, which is commonly known as Adiala, and other jails have female barracks. So women are imprisoned over there. So the female population is considerably lower than the male population in jails.
Okay.
And they have their separate barracks, and they in Central Jail Rawalpindi there's this big barrack where women are residing, and then there's also a solitary confinement, so one cell for the only woman who's on death row at Adiala. And then there are smaller cells which 4 women or 4 to 6 women share.
So what kind of I imagine that women in prisons might require a different approach from male prisoners, or is it also again the same?
Absolutely no, because women have different needs. They have different medical needs, different sanitary needs, and also we need to remember that quite a few women come with children. Either they're incarcerated with children. So at the time of incarceration, they come with children, or they're women who give birth to children in jails. So those women who are with toddlers or who are with babies, they of course have additional needs, because there's the need of the woman and then there's the need of the child. So babies under 2, they're given powder milk or formula milk, whatever you call it. This is provided by the jail authorities and also by donations from different NGOs. And then those who are above,
sorry, Rob, but how can women be incarcerated with children?
So, women, if they want their children to be with them in jail, those children are made to live with them in jails. But there are also women who give birth in jails. And I know, jail is not the ideal environment, not the ideal environment at all for women and for children, especially for children. But I do understand why women would want to have children with them in jails, because they are, at the end of the day, primary caretakers of children. And you also need to understand that a lot of these women who come to jails are either framed in cases or, are serving sentences on behalf of the male members of their families, their husbands. So there are a lot of women, yes, there are a lot of women in Pakistani prisons who've been imprisoned in drug crimes, and those women were merely, mules and couriers, and they more often than not, they don't even know if prior to getting incarcerated and arrested, they don't even know that, the car that they're traveling in has narcotics in it. So these men are either absconders, their husbands are either absconders, or if they're not absconders, then they don't really visit the women in jails. So a lot of women don't have their family members, exactly, I know. A lot of women don't have their family members visiting them, especially their husbands. They've been abandoned by their families and their husbands.
One is not allowed to use certain kind of languages on national television, but wow. Okay. So I also know that the Justice Project Pakistan works with the release of mentally ill prisoners as well. So could you tell me a little bit about that? Because sort of as a layperson, if somebody who's not mentally well commits a crime, shouldn't the law sort of deal with that differently as opposed to somebody who is compos mentis?
Absolutely. And there are laws in place. There's the Mental Health Ordinance of 2001, which is the governing law. And then there's some sections in the Pakistan Penal Code, section 464, 465, and section 84 that deal with people or prisoners with unsound mind, or even pre-trial, not prisoners, but those who are arrested. But again, the question is of implementation. I think over here, the larger debate is about the mindset of the general society about, who is a mentally ill person. And there's a range of mental illnesses, but unfortunately in Pakistan, only quite a few are recognized as mental illnesses.
Right.
And if somebody who does not, does not appear to be, or does not,
like if they don't kind of appear classically mentally unstable in a sort of very kind of basic way, which is actually not true for most people. A lot of people with mental health illnesses are not sort of, present like that all the time.
Absolutely, that's the issue. And, you cannot, under international obligations that Pakistan is a signatory to, the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, these are Article 6 and 7, and other, the Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities, you cannot execute a person who's mentally ill. And then
but you can imprison them. But you can imprison them. You can incarcerate them.
Incarcerate them, but you have to incarcerate them with care. There are special measures, or there should be special measures in place for mentally ill prisoners. And this is what we tried, or we attempted to do, we attempted to bring about a reform in the Punjab prison rules that we worked on, because as Omar stated, the Pakistan prison rules govern, the administration of prisons.
Yes.
But in reality, it's again a question of implementation. It's really not done. Because
and I imagine if prisons are already so overcrowded, sort of where are you going to make the space for a mentally ill prisoner who obviously requires a different kind of care and a more specialized care than the general population? So Jugnoo, tell me about strategic loss litigation, which I find really interesting because by doing strategic litigation, you're able to kind of set a precedent for then perhaps better, subsequent pursuit of justice.
Yes, and that is what JPP really aims to do: strategic litigation.
Yes, but what does that mean? Like, what is that?
I mean, I would say simply trying to get the prisoner his or her rights that he or she has been denied.
Yep.
And then, trying to just focus on one thing really. For instance, I'll give you an example. Strategic litigation would be to ask the prison authorities for medical records, because this is an issue that we face and prisoners face or their lawyers face. I mean, under the Pakistan prison rules and, under the law, basically, prisoners are entitled to, access their medical records, or their counsels are entitled to access medical records. But then again, it's not done in practice. So then JPP writes, numerous letters to jail authorities, to the home departments, and if that's not answered, then we go to court. And then, the court obviously summons jail authority. Because, what else do you do? This is something that is the prisoner's right. I mean, he or she must have access to his or her medical record.
Do you think that also difficulty to access something like a medical record, does that also play a part in the investigation at large? And would that be part of evidence, for example, that counsel would need to make a case?
Absolutely.
I'm thinking about like sexual violence as well. I'm sure that would apply in that sort of situation as well.
Absolutely, because you see, medical records are crucial when it comes to prisoners who are juveniles and prisoners who are mentally ill. You absolutely have to access to determine, those who are mentally ill. When did this mental illness started? What treatment did they receive? What they were like prior to incarceration, and same for juveniles as well. They're like I mentioned earlier about the ossification tests that are done by courts, and then access to those ossification tests. So that's just, I think it's a crucial piece of evidence, especially in the case of mentally ill and juvenile prisoners, because you cannot make your case otherwise if you do not have access to them.
Right. And Omar, you were talking this as well before the break, before you sort of shocked me, is that a lot of cases fall through because of a lack of evidence.
But the vast majority of cases fall through because witnesses resign. And that's the other interesting element here, is that our criminal justice system still relies primarily on eyewitness testimony, and not as much on forensic evidence or physical evidence that's been collected. And this is despite the fact that in Punjab, for example, we have a world-class Punjab Forensic Science Agency that is fully capable of processing crime scenes, of analyzing forensic evidence. But what we see is they're not called to the vast majority of cases.
Oh gosh, so we have this excellent facility, but they're not being used properly.
So they're not being used properly. And again, the challenge is with implementation. And then going back to strategic litigation, for example, there's a very interesting public interest litigation case that's currently in the Lahore High Court, which talks about what's called the two-finger test or virginity testing. And that again, the idea is to use the courts, which is one way to get access to your rights in Pakistan, to use the courts to improve the experience of survivors of sexual violence, so that they stay a part of the criminal justice system, so that they're not re-victimized through it and then compelled to fall out, leading to an acquittal at the end of it.
Absolutely. So it's a kind of double-edged sword where we obviously have laws in place that are helpful laws and are well-intentioned laws, and we have institutions in place which can do the work, like the forensic center that you mentioned, but there is still a huge gap between these institutions that institutions such as yours are working very hard to bridge. Thank you so much, Omar, for being on the show. Thank you, Jugnoo, for joining us across the internets. Thank you guys for watching. I am certain that you have learned just as much about the criminal justice system as I have today. Many things to take home. Thank you guys for watching. If you are watching this on YouTube, don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you next time on the coffee table. Bye now.